while continuing to pursue their independent practices. Their first collaboration resulted in a publication, Lost Property, in '96. Later that year, they presented a project entitled Errata as a part of the Now Here exhibition at Louisiana Museum of Modern Art in Denmark. In '97, they were included in a material culture exhibition at the Hayward Gallery, and also produced the guide Browse, which was available at both the British Museum and Selfridges as a part of the collected project they worked on. More recently, they have curated an exhibition and related series of events pour les curieux at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire at Geneva, and are currently artists in residence at the Design Council Archive. It goes almost without saying that, considering the range of events, activities, venues and institutions that they have worked with over the last 5 years or 4 years, all their projects move beyond a tight definition of studio practice, and indeed pursue an interest in how practice of art fit into the wider culture, the material culture. Their talk tonight is accompanied with slides, video and CD-ROM, and they're very interested in questions from the floor afterwards. But for the meantime, would you welcome along with me Neil and Marysia this evening.
Thanks very much. I think Andrew's just done the lecture, actually. So, where was this? Sorry, where was that? Okay, I thought to begin with, we'll just sketch some of the ideas and the context, I guess, in which some of our projects have grown out of. So, as artists, I suspect Marysia and I are not that interested in art. I mean, not that we're not interested in art, but we're not interested to struggle to produce artifacts that might be designated as art. Because clearly there's enough stuff in the world, and clearly there's enough art in the world. So one of the things that we've been trying to think about more and more is the mechanisms that structure and frame the objects of art itself. So, in this instance, this is not a Magritte. So we've been thinking about all of those institutions, all of those agencies that squeeze the work of art into being, if you like, trying to think through some of the discourses of art itself. So this would include thinking about and working with a whole set of interrelated agencies, which might include lectures like this, might include talks, might include teaching, might include students, exhibitions, studios, galleries, and the people who run them. It might include working with dealers and collectors, might include talking with curators, might include going to openings and private views and hoping to get invited to those dinners that take place afterwards. It's talking to critics, reading texts, reading catalogues, collecting catalogues, making sure you're very well advertised, reading books, talking to administrators, meeting the people who dispense lottery funding, meeting the people who dispense sponsorship. Of course, I could go on. We could all go on for quite a long time. But principally, I think we've been thinking about how museums function, what museums do, the technologies they deploy, and the way they display artifacts. So principally, I think principally we've been working with museums. So, as an artist, to be subject to all these myriad forces, if you like, the traditional practice or the traditional image or the received image of the practice of the artist may no longer be relevant. And the artist themselves, if he or she ever was, is not the originator of the work of art, but is a chain, in a long chain, of links and institutions and relationships that squeeze the effect of the work of art into being. It's what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has called the field of cultural production. There's an essay of the same title. So as well as being interested in all of those relationships that I've outlined above, we're also fascinated at the edges of those spaces. between those various practices of art. Sorry, you should have been looking at this when I was talking about museums. Those various practices of art, and if you like, a wider interrelated field of things. What anthropologists have termed the material of culture, or material culture studies. Essentially how people make sense of their lives through the things that they collect and display. This is the British Museum shop at Heathrow Airport. Because it's clear that on an individual and, if you like, on a cultural scale, we are described by a bewildering range of stuff. The stuff that surrounds all of us, the clothes we use, the tools we use, the art we collect and display, the trinkets we give one another, the gifts we give one another, the cuisine we prepare for each other, the architecture we build for one another, souvenirs we collect, electronic technology we all use, and the rubbish that we throw out at the end of it. So that whole gamut of material things. And it's clear to us that objects and images are spilling from every shelf, every cupboard, every display case, every television, every vitrine, every supermarket, every gallery, shop, museum, and landfill site. So we don't need more things. We need to think carefully about the things we already have. And it's extraordinary that through this range of material stuff that we're all embedded in and with, it's through these things that we bind ourselves together into smaller groups or into larger social clusters as student, as designer, as architect, as artist, as carpenter. We recognize one another through this stuff, as North American, as British, whatever. And yet simultaneously, each of us feels so special and unique. And if you like, that is the extraordinary power within contemporary culture, that you can make yourself feel so individual out of essentially the same products. So this dialectical play between the singular and the serial is something that seems to haunt a lot of what we do. So I guess as such we're interested in the mechanisms, again a term from anthropology, in the mechanisms of exchange. Exchange being this rather general term for essentially anything that you swap, your labour, your money, your service, your time, or your emotion, or the things you might swap for essentially more labour, more money, more service, more time, or more things. So what are the mechanisms that squeeze those kind of relationships, those kind of exchanges? And it's often the context, it seems, that authorise the kind of artefacts through which things move. So essentially the same thing, the same Philippe Starck toothbrush can be in Brick Lane on an old towel for sale, can be in your friend's bathroom, or it can be in the design museum. Essentially the toothbrush doesn't change, it's your relationship to it through the context that changed. So here in a restaurant in southern Poland, they liked the carpet so much, they framed it and put it on the wall. So it's probably a very moot point about whether the context authorises your relationship to the object or whether your relationship to the object authorises the context. Too difficult to say, maybe. Okay, I was going to digress a bit into ideas about value, but maybe we can come to those in the questions. So it's really out of that field of interest that I'll start talking about some of the projects Marysia and I have made together. And the first is this. In this crude model of the material world that I've outlined for you, in which exchange is the motor, the driving force, we've put the department store at one end and the museum at the other, the public museum. They're the two great inventions of the 19th century, I think. And they're both emblematic of sites of accumulation. And we could think of our domestic spaces as fitting between these two joined, almost magnetic poles, which repel each other because it's very difficult to think about two places in the same breath. And yet they seem to have very similar roots and very similar drives. So if you can believe me, and those two spaces are sites of massive accumulation, and think of the whole infrastructure that holds those places, allows those places to operate. I think it's fair to say that Marysia and I began to think about spaces where that was redundant. And we began to think about the lost property office in central London, which is essentially collects everything which is lost on the London transportation system. So we began to think about some kind of sink, some kind of unconscious space between these sites of accumulation. And we visited the underground store of all the lost property, and began to try and open up discussions with the lost property office about whether we could do some kind of thing with them for this extraordinary place. I don't know if any of you have ever been, if you've lost something, but it has a very small physical presence, but it's an extremely emotional space. It's in a disused underground car park, so all your stored goods are 3 floors underground. There's a small office where you go and try and reclaim your found things. So it's extremely emotional, but there's no display. There's no sense of display of the artifacts themselves. So we approached, or Marysia was approached by the Public Art Development Trust to make some proposals for redesigning some underground stations. And we had this idea about somehow using the Lost Property Office. That project fell through, but we were so convinced there was something good to do with this Lost Property Office that we essentially had the idea of trying to index or catalogue everything that's lost on one day. And what lost property is the 375 things that are lost and not reclaimed every day on the London transportation system. So about 1,000 things are lost. All the others, someone comes and collects them. 375 aren't. So we made this catalogue. Sorry, that's just a shot of the underground system. We made this catalogue of lost things. Because if you like, in either of those sites of accumulation, the museum or the store, there is this sense that loss haunts everything. You can never insure yourself against loss. So it haunts even your most precious possession. Even that new iMac you've just got, it could go, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So there's something about loss that haunts all of this, which gives the sense of trying to catalogue this loss a kind of double edge, in that we try to photograph the objects in a very forensic style. So we were trying to use the sense of trying to document these things, but they're even missing from the photographs. So in a sense it tries to parody the perfection of a museum catalogue, but it slightly failed. Now, we set up a studio inside the Lost Property Office. But even though Public Art Development Trust helped in terms of financing, there wasn't enough money to produce the book itself. So we had the photographs, but we had no money to produce the book. And we'd seen that Paul Smith, the fashion designer, had a show at the Design Museum, and he seemed to have a really quirky sense of collecting material that are the roots of his designs. And he seemed to have the right kind of attitude, perhaps. So we sent him a fax saying, we have this book, it's coming up to Christmas, it was October. We said we have this book, it would make the perfect Christmas gift. Christmas, of course, the sign of where accumulation is at its most extreme. And Paul Smith wrote a letter back saying it's a great idea. So he essentially bought he bought half of the edition up front, which gave us enough money to produce the whole book. And we tried to think through carefully what kind of book this should be. We worked very closely with Stephen Coates, a designer, and we decided that Lost Property should be the kind of book that you really wanted. So it has a very lush pink cover. It's designed to fit in your pocket. So in a sense it's designed to enter the very thing we try to rescue, in a failed sense, rescue those objects from. Because you just might have it in your pocket, you just might be on the tube and you just might lose it. So as if it has this built-in desire within it to be lost. And on your left you can see when you lose anything you have to go and fill out a very detailed form at the Lost Property Office. And it's extraordinary how rich those texts are, because people can remember when stitches were missing on jumpers that their grandmothers knitted for them. People can remember the cleaning instructions in their suits. They can remember minute details of their handbags. So there's this extraordinary investment that people have in things. And we try to use some of those texts like images themselves. Okay, I stand back. Can we run a video?
Yeah, we have a video now. I wanted to just say a few things about another project which is called Currency, and just to begin with something that was written by a friend who's an artist, to give you some context how it came about. There is a long road, the Holloway Road in London, with things in it, things bartered and sold and exchanged. Things are cheap in the road. They're on the last leg of their journeys from commodity to waste. They are detritus, the leftovers of the leftovers. This is where all these things that you're seeing in front of you originate, from the Holloway Road. And it was a project which kind of required sifting through the realm of everything. But it's not possible to really sift but without some sense of organization. So the way these things were selected and in the end brought into equivalence was their arbitrarily set price. So they're all things which have a value of £1. But their equivalence is, on one hand, that they're sold for £1, but also, in this case, their equivalence is through all of them being photographs. And this idea of inventing this arbitrary equivalent, in this case the £1, in a way mirrors the arbitrariness of all other organizing structures. What it also allows is that it defies narrative or any kind of sentimentality, but it also acts as a device which means that nothing was chosen according to personal taste. So it acts as a mechanism of recovery for that which is truly missing, and not just from vision. So, I wouldn't necessarily choose these things because they wouldn't appeal to me. I wouldn't probably see them because they didn't appeal to me. So they were missing from my vision, but also from my consciousness. And as a video piece, it offers a kind of reenactment of the loop of consumption and spectacle. And all the objects here, seems to me, have fallen through the net of being desired or desirable. And even their selection, as they're sort of parading here, presents them as unredeemable. So it's a fairly kind of simple device, and in a way, through this kind of agency of art, the vernacular and the social are examined and offered for reflection. Because what seems to happen all the time is that the everyday is mostly transparent, and it is also mostly left unarticulated. So that's just a way of, articulating kind of vernacular moment of the Holloway Road, which might be symptomatic of some other moments too. This goes on for quite a while, but I guess maybe we'll have enough to just give a sense what the project is and go to the next one. Yeah, errata. Okay.
Okay, the third thing we thought we'd show you is a project that took place in the Museum of Modern Art in Denmark called Louisiana. I'm sure some of you already know this museum. It was during a time when Lars Nidfer, who's now head of the Tate at Bankside, took over Louisiana, and his idea was to move out. It has an extraordinary kind of classic modernist collection. His plan was to move out this rather sleepy collection and to reinvigorate the museum by inviting three internationally renowned curators, to shake the museum up. And as part of that, Bruce Ferguson, a Canadian curator, curated a section called Walking and Thinking and Walking. I'm sure some of you who know Louisiana, it's probably the most beautiful museum in the world. It's built in a very ancient park. Yeah, ancient park, about 40 minutes outside Copenhagen. And it overlooks the sea that separates Denmark from Sweden. And the museum, as it's grown from the 50s onwards, I think, has been very sensitive to its natural environment. Quite a large part of the museum is built underground, not to obscure the view of the sea. It has long glazed corridors, so you can admire the ancient trees as you walk. I think it's a kind of place where people spend the whole day. They drive from Copenhagen and spend the whole day. You can go to the beach and swim. You can have a fantastic lunch in the cafe. So there's a sense that the whole museum experience is a very leisurely, very cultured, but very leisurely experience. And as you walk through I'm just going to read you a short piece of text. As you walk through the museum, its spaces unfold. Entrance, gallery, corridor, garden, another gallery, children's house. They have the most respected children's education department in the world, I think. Cafe, beach, reading room, terrace and shop. The shift in qualities of space is reflected in the values of the artifacts those spaces contain. If not the artifacts, then in the quality of attention you extend to them. They have an extremely aggressive shop which markets modern classics, as you can see. The shop also commissions limited edition multiples by artists. So a parallel material sequence to the walk you've just taken might go money, painting, chair, print, sculpture, tree, postcard, another painting, book, glass, and souvenir. And we spent quite a lot of time in the museum, and what's apparent is that not only do people really enjoy the museum, they enjoy the experience of the museum, but it began to be clear to us that there were some very strange moments when the security of the museum collection, and the museum is very secure in what it recognizes as works of art, and your experience of the museum itself were quite at odds. So what we proposed was an errata to their catalogue of their collection. As with most museums, they have a very thick and very extensive catalogue that catalogue all the work in their collection. But while we recognized that they were very sensitive to their natural environment and how the museum extended itself through its natural environment, they seemed completely insensitive as to how they extended themselves through their material environment. So errata fits in the back of their catalogue and catalogues all the things they've left out, which is the things that the shop commissions from artists but are not part of the museum collection, which are things that the Children's Museum collects but are not considered part of the collection. We also thought carefully about how the catalogue itself presents things through photography, so that the tonne hat rack and coat rack in a different context could be part of the museum collection, as could the bird's house. When you sit in their cafe, you're sitting on furniture which has just been reissued by Vitrine, and it's considered a design classic, which is the Hans Corre aluminium chair from 1936. So what happens? What's the difference between using the chair in the cafe and paying attention to it if it was on display? So errata, while being an errata to the catalogue itself, was also a guide to the museum, in that you could pick it up and use it to try and decipher, or not to decipher. I think our idea was that it would invite you, the visitor, to feel when those slips were taking place. So, obvious things like when a work of art is in storage, is it still a work of art? What's the status of those bags that are authorized and stamped with the museum's logo? That's the back of errata, which acts as the guide to the museum itself. So we tried just to think about those slips, those exclusions of the collection, where art slips into artifact and back again. We tried to think about how it uses its reproductions and its photographs to authorize. Again, we worked with Stephen Coates, the designer, but he just copied their graphic style exactly, so there's no trace of design at all. At the end of the exhibition, the museum wanted to buy something, but we really had nothing to sell. So what we agreed was that every time we signed a contract, that every time they reprint their catalogue, they have to reprint errata. We were going to talk about a CD, but that will run at the end, so it's just to remind you that there will be contents. I just wanted to talk briefly about Collected, which was an exhibition at the Photographers Gallery principally, but at various other sites around central London in 1997. And it was a way of using the idea of collecting to link together the practices that we all use individually, perhaps, to make sense of what you might consider to be a kind of profligate material world. There's just so much stuff. How can you possibly try and make a space for yourself? And what it seems to do is that people seem to collect things, to order things. And that same desire could be a kind of institutional desire, or we could fold that to an institutional desire, and to look at the institutions we've evolved to structure those collections. If you remember, I talked about department stores and public museums. So as well as an exhibition at the Photographer's Gallery, there was an exhibition at the Wallace Collection, which is essentially 3 generations of English aristocrats being obsessed by French taste. And Andrea Fraser made an installation here, an American artist, which pointed out how a certain class within Britain has left their private taste. So it's their knickknacks that have become public culture. It was also at Selfridge's department store. It was at a private apartment of someone called Richard Lowe, who collects Egyptian, I hope you won't mind me saying this, Egyptian kitsch material. So Richard Lowe's whole apartment is covered with Egyptian material, from his teaspoons to his mugs, to his t-shirts, to the paintings of Egyptian burial sites on his walls. It was at Sir John Soane's house. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Sir John Soane's house. Again, an instance of where private culture becomes public. It was at the Royal College of Surgeons Museum. It was at Habitat department store. And again, it was in our old friend Paul Smith's shop in Floral Street, where Paul Smith displayed some of his private collections of kitsch in his windows for the duration of the exhibition. So again, trying to think about where does private taste become commercial or public culture. It was also in the British Museum, where Richard Wentworth and Fred Wilson made installations. But what I'm trying to get to is this. This is called Browse. And Marysia and I negotiated with Selfridge's department store and the British Museum to produce this leaflet, which is an extremely flimsy piece of material. And Browse was in leaflet holders in Selfridge's, and it was in leaflet holders at the British Museum. And you could pick it up at either site. It looked like perhaps something that the education department had produced in the British Museum, or it looked like something that the marketing department in Selfridge's had produced. But when the various visitors to either of those sites picked it up and opened it, it was never, you were asked to think about what were the images you were looking at. And what those images related to was not very clear, or the sites that those images belonged in were jumbled up. So Browse mimicked the language that both advertising uses, and we mimicked, of course, in the look of the leaflet itself, something perhaps that advertising would produce. We mixed the language of advertising in with the language of museology. We photographed contemporary things in black and white and re-photographed some of the Egyptian artifacts in colour, in lush colour, so that the photograph and the leaflet wouldn't anchor those things. So it was to fold the experience back upon you, the leaflet holder. I mean, we could, if you want, at the end go into negotiations. This took 2 years to produce, because the British Museum are anxious not to let any text or any image beyond their control. They wanted to control every comma and every noun in this leaflet. And curiously, Selfridges were exactly the same. Both were extremely protective about their image and wouldn't want it tampered with. So it took extremely long and extremely close negotiation. And when we had to send a dummy of it, of course, to Selfridges, when they saw it, they said, well, it looks great, but shouldn't it say Selfridges after every object that comes from Selfridges? And we said, well, it could, but don't you think that would sort of give it away? And they said, well, but we're very concerned that we might have shoppers who will try to buy these things. And we said, yeah, of course. And they said, well, we're worried that maybe they'll be a bit confused about what they're supposed to buy. And we said, yeah, of course. And at that point, it was kind of too late. They'd already committed themselves to the project. So although they were both extremely suspicious and extremely resistant at every level, they were both thrilled because they couldn't keep these in the leaflet holders fast enough. So they printed 190,000 and they had to ration how they went out. And I think it's fair to say it's our experience of working with all institutions. They seem to be extremely resistant at every level, but if the project's a success, they pretend that it was their initiation. The British Museum has used Browse as an example of their open and committed engagement with their public, and the Wallace collection, who were the most obnoxious institution I've ever worked with, arrogant beyond belief, used Andrea Fraser's installation there to justify their lottery application to build a new cafe in their courtyard. Okay, now it's the CD.
I'll just say a few things about how it came about, and also maybe it truly relates to the title of the talk, which is Everything. We were invited by a gallery in Leuven, in Belgium, to, well, it was quite an open invitation, so we could really do whatever we like in their new space. And what their new space was a house in which they moved into, which is what you'll see in a minute. But when they moved into the house, which is, I think, a sort of 5-story Art Deco house, it was already full of things that the previous owners left there in storage. And the things that were left were there, in fact, from the very beginning when the house was commissioned, which was something like 1917. And through some, I think, family dispute, that's a picture of the house taken by the original owners. Through a dispute, the owners of the house kind of left in the 60s, and it was locked up, and then the gallery owners were given an opportunity to move in. And when they moved in, they cleared the central space, which is kind of salon, and painted it white and called it a gallery. And of course that was where, you know, the invitation was to do something in that space. But it seemed that that was the least interesting part of the house. Everything else seemed much more, in a way it was like a discovery. We could never have come across this kind of mess of 2 sets of lives from the beginning of the century and the lives of the current occupants who are gallery owners, and their things kind of toppled one on top of the other. So, you know, like the temptation initially was to create another catalogue or to somehow think of an order. And I think the more we spent time in the house, it seemed like there was no order, and in a way that was the important thing to realize, to kind of let go of trying to impose an order of our own. So this is what in fact originally was a slideshow which we staged in the living room of the house. So when, during the exhibition, when people came to see the show, they were just seated in the living room and watched what is something like a kind of home slideshow. So I think we'll maybe leave this running. This takes a little while since there are so many things in the house. But maybe it's a good moment to go to questions. What? Lights, yeah. Is it? Yeah. So maybe turn these off. Maybe like this, yeah?
So I'd like to appropriate you and turn you into my case study. I'm really working on this. I'm dealing with government services, and I'd like to ask you, how do you see these boundaries between these different fields? I mean, looking at what you said about audio, of course we can't escape from, and how do you see these notions of the different fields and working in different fields? Do you think we should abolish these boundaries, or do you consider that it's actually preferable to have these boundaries defined so we can actually cross them and just take all these different meanings and appropriate all these different contexts where we can place an object and get the most out of it? Or do you see this, the using of advertising techniques and the sort of erasure of those boundaries? How do you, I suppose strategically, how do you think about the boundary?
I guess it's much more tactical in our case. I think strategically, I think the time for strategy's gone, and I think it's much more tactical. And I think it is using our recognition of those boundaries. I mean, obviously, you're asking an extremely complicated question in a way. But I think it is using mechanisms that already exist, using mechanisms that already are recognizable, both by the institution and by the users of those institutions, but slightly, perhaps hoping people are made more conscious of those boundaries in their use of them or in their encounter with them.
How do you think of your next best thing?
Sorry?
How do you think of your next thing, your next best move?
Next best move.
You mean that's related to tactics?
But this is always intrigued me ever since I've what the conceptual art is. It's not clear what your métier actually is.
Mm.
So the question is, like, and if you're not working from commission, then what sense of futurity do you have?
Mm. I think it's a mixture of both. I mean, I think there are people, if you like, seeking us out in terms of commissions, but there's also things that obviously need doing. And I think it's that drives you forward. Not any particular technique, not any particular, as you say, métier. It's more, you can see that there's things that need addressing. And either situations present themselves, or I think we try and make situations in which to work.
But I mean, there's a very simple sense in which I can have a real problem with any work like this. It's nothing to do with the quality. It's that, you know, if I was to talk to a painter, I would presume that, you know, the next work is going to be another painting. Works into conceptual art, I mean, it has lost that predictability.
But that seems a good thing, no?
Well, it might be.
Well, in a way, you know, the kind of fluidity that, which is not, you know, an investment in any one medium, but as you could probably see, there is an investment in, you know, a set of ideas, an investigation, an inquiry, something that joins all these projects, which, you know, they are not really that arbitrary. There is a kind of, you know, common thread. And I guess we quite consciously chose this particular set of projects. But it also, you know, it feels that it exposes both what we're trying to look at and the act of looking. So, you know, the whole question of mediation, which is whether it will be a leaflet, a video, a lecture, that these are, or, you know, these are all kind of as important as what it is that we're looking at.
Just wanted to make this point that I'm against calling this conceptualized. I would call it a conceptualizing practice. I don't call, I mean, okay, some people may be painting as impressionists nowadays, right? But I wouldn't call it, I wouldn't call this conceptual art because I think conceptual art was a set of practices early in the 60s, and I think we're working nowadays and we sort of, you know, I think you're taking that heritage, but I think we've moved forward from some of those premises that we did in conceptualize. So I think to call it conceptualizing, you know, conceptual practice, not really.
Sounds good.
It's very good.
Not so much a question, but just an attempt to make the conversation continue. In relation to, let's say, your interest with respect to how the object within relation to the institution might change its status, how that institution confers cultural and economic status on the object. What I'm interested in is the triad in relation to how does the object, which is the artwork, the institution which is represented, and its relationship to the viewer might sort of inform that particular relationship. So, in a simple way, what's absent in these images, which I'm sure not the case of putting into practice, is the relationship with the viewer. It shares a kind of similar relationship to architect recognition, where the person engaged with this particular object is always absent. Their photographs look like an architectural space without that person in it. How does that actually influence work? How does it actually test within work?
You mean that the people are absent from
Yeah.
these things?
Yeah, I mean, all the fact that when you look at these objects, there's no kind of reference to the person or their sort of relationship to how they might be consumed.
Yeah. That's a question. Can I answer it by telling you about something else, really, which is we've just been commissioned as artists in residence at the Design Council Archive, and they have 120,000 black and white photographs of objects from 1945 to around 1990, and it's an extraordinary archive, but there's not a single person pictured using those objects. They're just they have this kind of classic sort of modernist photographic practice, which is they're always shot against an infinity ground, quite strong shadows, and the objects just exist, and you have no sense of like how people use them. And I think it's a constant problem. It is almost unrepresentable, because I think some of the things we've done before is to because you don't know what people do with things. People might buy a bottle of wine, but they might use it to hold the door open. Like, you just don't know, firstly, how people are invested in those things, or very rarely, perhaps, do you? And I think even when we try to represent those texts from the lost property, which are, as I tried to say to you, extremely moving, in a way they are absent, or you have to picture the person who wrote that text, because the person's absent, and the intensity of the emotion in some sense is absent.
To what extent then, if when we try to just come to a slightly different way, not so much in the sense of your next work, but in terms of the sequence, if you like, the tradition in your practice. A practice that has used fragments of the real world, or samples or metonyms from the real world, I suppose, but in collage. But collage originally began as a pictorial practice that still gravitated around the idea of composition, and that the pieces were assembled, composed, fragmented, perhaps, with an influence that made a picture. Now, the reason I said since conceptual art, not limited to conceptual art, it is something to do with the unraveling of the notion of a pictorial composition of the color into the form, into a kind of temporal form of practice, so that instead of objects which were being simultaneous, they are sequential. And the mode of assembly in which you gather, collect, organize, and represent has obviously changed. But one might be challenged to say, well, is this in some sense a transformation of a collage tradition?
But whether that's useful to think like that, I'm not sure. While we might be aware of different organizing devices, because although collage might seem like lots of things thrown together, it's a very particular organizing device, and I don't really feel that there is that much connection with this and how we might organize. Because I think the one thing that's missing and difficult to make that palpable in a talk is that with a thing like browse, which has such a slight presence as a thing, and in fact a whole number of people who picked it up and know us told us that they went and looked for these objects that are kind of represented here. So they went to Selfridges and tried to find that Barbie doll, which tells you much more about the kind of habit of, that they were still seeking the object, while, they were sort of seeking where the art is, while the art was here, in that moment where this, which was just in a holder in a department store, asked for some reflection, and that reflection doesn't necessarily come at that moment of consumption. And I think that's something that we're very aware, and I feel like that's part of the tactic, is that I think there is a space for a kind of slowing down consumption of objects, including art objects. So whatever is contained here as an experience, it doesn't necessarily it has a kind of immediate moment of you wanting to pick it up because of the way it looks. But what it may do to you, might happen in a very different moment. So those two moments don't need to be kind of symmetrical in a way.
I sort of detect two ways of presenting your work in two different kinds of work. I'm interested in the relation between them. Neil's kind of beginning sounded very much like a sort of institutional critique, kind of ethnography of art, critique of the institution, how is the object presented in frame and so on, approach. And yet as the projects progress, there's more and more a sense of kind of saving things that are lost, or sort of poignancy, melancholy, uncanny even with this contents project, which is, I went to see. It's spooky place, perhaps, and very strange. And the work sort of seems to divide between projects like Errata and Browse, on the one hand, which sort of have to do with, say, museum and art, and then the projects that have to do with things that fall through, that have a different sort of feeling. I mean, it almost seems to me like a sort of idea of salvation in the Benjaminian sense, better saving things which would otherwise be lost, or at the end everything has to be resurrected, even the most insignificant, which he uses as a sort of counter thought to the idea of the museum as the spoils of the victors. All the things that aren't the spoils of the victors have to somehow be given the opportunity to come back. So I wondered how you felt about those two aspects of the work and how they relate to each other, if you feel there are two aspects.
I think there are probably more aspects, although these seem, the way you've grasped what is here now, because, there are lots of other projects which we haven't talked about, that maybe, it kind of oscillates between something that truly is frightening in some ways. It's this kind of institutional grip which we all experience, and more or less have to take a position to, whether through teaching or making. But it also seems that it's maybe quite important to that these other projects are this kind of underlying failure of these institutions somehow having a grip on all of it. So maybe it is like a sort of pulse that only by and maybe these especially contents and lost property and currency are very much trying to run concurrently, but then kind of jump the ship. So there's kind of a number of other projects that are developing this year, and I think there is another aspect which is kind of difficult to articulate, is that all of these, in fact, shown in this selection, are very discreet in many ways. So although it might be an institution like the British Museum, which is awesome, that it's just this, but it is enough to maybe impart with just a gesture to kind of to lead to some reflection. So ultimately, I don't think that it actually falls under this institutional critique, although that might be, where the roots of some of these works are. That in the end, that's also, kind of historically maybe spent. That, there is some kind of other concerns which are maybe to do with the vernacular. And if there is a term which I think belongs to Richard Francis, who curated a show in Chicago, which was called Radical Scavengers, and he used this term of the conceptual vernacular, and maybe that's kind of, a place where this can be seen.
And I mean, I think if there is that schism, then I think I'd like to have my one foot in each place. I mean, in the place of the vernacular and the nostalgic. As a kind of child of the 50s, maybe it's kind of seeped in my genes, a kind of nostalgia, the things that never were. At the same time, I'm conscious that institutions grip us all, and I mean, I think institutional critique has somehow got a very nasty taste suddenly, but I'm happy with it. I mean, what's kind of missing from the things you're watching is it's the slideshow and the CD-ROM is prefaced by a quote from Swift, which in fact might relate to Michael's question in some way. Swift, writing in Gulliver's Travels in 1726, where he, in a kind of bitingly satirical way, says, well, because breath is the thing that keeps you alive. So you don't want to waste your breath, you really want to conserve it. So when you meet people that you know in the street, don't waste your breath on them. If you want to have a conversation, you should just swap things. And surely all of us can carry with us enough things in our pockets to have a conversation. And he says, well, and then if you want kind of more detailed conversations, you should invite people to your houses, because then you'll have more stuff and you will have a longer, more detailed and extensive conversation. Because he says, well, look, things are a universal language. So something that in 1726 looks wickedly satirical, in 1999 begins to look kind of prophetic.
Maybe we should finish here.
No, I don't know.
Unless, we'll probably go upstairs to...
Upstairs. But in the meantime, once again, maybe we can thank Neil and Rich.
Oh, yeah? Thank you.
Bob's your uncle, thanks very much. Thanks for that. Tolerance for being a lecturer, I think.
And video?
You did, it's nice.